Now, hello everyone. My name is Nais Saadani, and I'm the Executive Director of the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. I'm pleased to be welcoming you to today's event and inviting you to join us for this important conversation titled Toward a Just and Equitable Political and Economic Reconstruction in Lebanon. As many of you know, for the first time in more than 2 years, Lebanon has a president, a prime minister, and a government in place. Domestic, regional, and global conditions have shifted, and along with them, that means that prospects for political and economic reconstruction, recovery, and reform have shifted too. This is a moment filled with challenge, but it's also filled with potential. And we're pleased to be bringing together a group of really esteemed speakers to discuss through these challenges and opportunities and to discuss the really critical juncture that Lebanon finds itself in. Today's conversation is being hosted on Zoom as well as live on YouTube. Please join us. Please engage in the conversation. I'd just like to welcome and introduce our moderator for today's conversation, my colleague, the wonderful Nadine Khishin, who we are lucky to have as a legal associate at TIMEP. Nadine is also an international and criminal human rights lawyer who's been working on conflict and human rights in the Middle East since 2016. She will guide us through today's discussion, first contextualizing the chat, then introducing our speakers, and then jumping right into the discussion. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, May, and thanks for everyone who's joining us today. We really appreciate your time. Um, as May mentioned, if you've been monitoring Lebanon for the past couple of years, you know that it's been going through a really tough time. Over the past few years, Lebanon has faced one major crisis after another, beginning with the unprecedented financial collapse of 2019, declared by the World Bank to be one of the worst financial and economic crises since the mid-19th century, followed by the COVID-19 pandemic, which exacerbated that crisis. Then the August 4th Beirut port explosion, one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history that damaged much of the Lebanese capital, killed over 200 people and injured thousands of others. While the country was still reeling from these traumatic events, Israel began its genocidal devastation of Gaza while trading blows with Hezbollah at the border, and later escalating its attacks across much of the country. Over the course of these attacks, Israel has destroyed large swaths of civilian infrastructure, and many areas in South Lebanon are still facing daily attacks despite the ceasefire. Throughout these crises, Lebanon was plagued by political paralysis and government vacuums that prohibited policy reform and coherent centralized responses. However, Lebanon has finally elected a functioning government, and now is the opportunity for widespread policy reform to improve governance across the country, ensure support for those who have been most affected by these numerous crises, and crucially, ensure ethical reconstruction, rebuilding, and investment in Lebanon's infrastructure that ultimately advances the well-being of the country as a whole. Today's panel is intended to discuss the critical importance of this moment and what should be done as we look ahead. We're so lucky to be joined by such an impressive panel, beginning with Ali Nuruddin, who is a senior associate in TimeUp's Inclusive Economies program with a ton of experience on Lebanon's financial and economic policies and the economic impacts of conflict. Lama Karami is a PhD candidate and a lawyer specializing in law and public policy and has written extensively about legal reform and social justice issues. Dr. Jasmine Diab is also a senior associate in TimeUp's Inclusive Economies program focusing on migration, and she leads the Institute for Migration Studies at the Lebanese American University. And last but not least, we have Nizar Ghanem, the Director of Research at Triangle and the Alternative Policy Institute, or Badil. He is an expert on governance and development in the region. Today's conversation is a moderated discussion. We'll start with 2 rounds of moderated questions, and then we'll open up questions to the audience. We invite you to submit questions through the Zoom Q&A function, and we'll turn to them after the 2 rounds of moderated questions. So let's go ahead and get started. The first question is for Ali. Ali, Lebanon caught the attention of the world with the unprecedented financial collapse of 2019. Compounded crises continued thereafter, with Israel's aggression only being the latest. As we stand at this critical juncture, it's difficult to know where to start to pick up the pieces. What are Lebanon and the Lebanese people's key reconstruction needs, and what are the financial reforms necessary to make this reconstruction possible?
Thank you, Nadine, for the introduction. So it's been 6 months since the so-called ceasefire was declared in the end of last November. And by now, we have enough local and international reports to form a very basic understanding of the scale and the cost of the damages. So the most detailed estimates provided by the World Bank speak of like $7.2 billion in economic losses. These include disruptions to production, the closure or damage of businesses, and broader health and economic activity. On top of that, there are an additional $6.8 billion in physical damages. And here we are talking about direct destruction to housing and infrastructure. So we are looking at a total loss of around $14 billion. Just to grab the gravity of this number, it's worth noting that this figure is equivalent to like half of Lebanon's GDP. So what kind of funding we are looking at for reconstruction? According to the same estimates by the World Bank, the cost of rebuilding housing and infrastructure is approximately $8.4 billion. So this is more than a quarter of the Lebanese GDP. And let's just be clear, this amount only covers the physical damages. It doesn't account for the wider economic losses caused by halted production, displaced workers, or discontinued businesses. So out of that $8.4 billion, an amount ranging between $3 and $5 billion should be covered by the state's budget directly. These are related to essential infrastructure services and urgent needs that cannot wait for donor conferences, or they are integrated within existing programs. And this amount is equivalent approximately to the total public revenue. So this leaves us with roughly $3 to $5 billion that needs to come from external donors. And this is the amount is relying on the international community to provide. So the Lebanese government does have its own vision for how to secure this support. There have been ongoing discussions with the World Bank dating back to Najib Mikati's government to develop a comprehensive recovery plan under the bank's supervision. And this plan includes setting up a dedicated trust fund separate from the state budget with specific mechanisms for disbursement, procurement, and tendering. And based on this framework, a donor conference is supposed to be convened. But so far, that conference has been postponed. And we know that two types of conditions are generally set by the donor countries before the aid is released. The first type of conditions is political, and it involves security arrangements and the broader question of the status of Hezbollah's arms, an issue that depends on delicate local and regional and international balances, and it has its own context. The second type of conditions is economic. So donor countries are now linking their assistance to the implementation of reforms requested by the International Monetary Fund, especially those that would enable Lebanon to move into that recovery phase. And when we speak of economic recovery, we mean moving beyond the ongoing financial and monetary collapse that began in 2019. This is a multi-layered crisis that has simultaneously led to the collapse of the banking and financial sector, a sovereign debt default, and a currency crisis. And it led to poverty tripling in 1 decade, reaching 44% in 2022. And we have to remember here that social protection is available only for 20% of the first population. What I want to emphasize in a few quick points is this point. Implementing these economic reforms is first and foremost in Lebanon's own interest. These are not just foreign imposed conditions. They are essential steps that we must take if we want reconstruction to be efficient, effective, and timely. And I can give 3 main reasons quickly here. First, the reconstruction process will bring a large inflow of funds between $3 and $5 billion into the financial system. And there must be a minimum level of stability in the financial sector to manage these cash flows effectively without losing part of these funds due to the existing losses in the banking sector. And we already have a very poor precedent in this regard when the aid for Syrian refugees entered the financial system in US dollars, but it was dispersed in Lebanese lira at undervalued exchange rate. So the financial and monetary. So the financial and monetary stability here is essential. Second, managing such massive reconstruction effort requires active and efficient public institutions. And that in return depends on restoring order to the state's finances and ensuring that ministries and public agencies have funding they need to operate. So without a capable public administration, there will be no way to properly monitor the reconstruction process or guarantee transparent and fair procurement practices. And finally, in many areas of South Lebanon, the damage went far beyond destroyed homes and infrastructure. The social and economic fabric of entire communities has been shattered. So restarting economic life in these areas requires investment in key sectors, the creation of jobs, and efforts to help people return to their villages. And none of this is possible without a healthy financial environment that can support investment. So this is my main message today. I'll stop here. We can continue on the second round, talking about what the government has achieved till now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ali. Clearly, the government has its work cut out for it, and it's going to be quite a task ahead. As we just mentioned, we've just recently elected a president and a prime minister, which ended the stalemate that we've had for at least the last 2 years, if not longer, as we had several successive governments only having caretaker capacity, not being able to push through laws and policies. So question for Nizar, what were the key political challenges for the country in the lead up to this moment? And what are the challenges that might lay ahead?
Thank you, Nadine, and thank you for having me. I mean, I think to get to this government, we need to understand that Lebanon had been witnessing since the assassination of Hariri, if you want, an imbalance of regional power dynamics, because Lebanon's government since the 1990s was based on the idea that there's a détente or some kind of balance of power between Syria and Saudi Arabia. This, with the assassination of Hariri, we entered into basically the Syrian quagmire and civil war eventually, and Lebanon was in a state of imbalance, if you want. Now, this all the way led to the if you want, the waning of our political system, coupled with the collapse of the economic model since the 1990s. The economic model, as Ali kind of insinuated as well, but the model was based on the idea that, it's a rent-seeking economy based on a lot of elite capture. So 5-6 families rule most of the economy, and there's a lot of high informality in the economy. So there's a collapse of the economic model, and then there's the new balance of power, as I was mentioning, which is started in Syria. With the current fall of the Syrian regime meant that Iran has retreated now. Assad regime has been basically dismantled. Iran is not on the Mediterranean anymore. There's a Turkish role that is expanding. Turkey is right now in Damascus, basically. And there's all these question marks about, of course, the Arab-Israeli peace process. So we do have this whole, the Israeli-Hezbollah, Israeli-Iran war led to a new balance of power, if you want, in the region, that led to a third way candidacy with the coming of the current government and presidency, which basically is a figure that is seen by both Hezbollah and even the bank cartels as acceptable to form a new balance of power. Or a new government that could somehow establish stability. The question is, will this continue? For that to continue, we need a couple of things, which I will mention. I think we need definitely a national defense dialogue, meaning that if you're going to bring Hezbollah into the government, this requires a framework and a policy framework, specifically, how to dismantle Hezbollah's paramilitary forces and integrate them within the army. But this requires a serious look at our fiscal policy and our taxation and the whole, basically, social contract, because this requires about more than 20,000 maybe soldiers to enter the Lebanese army. This requires a whole national dialogue to if you want, re-implement the Ta'if Accord, which was not completely implemented. So this national defense dialogue has to happen, because I don't think that we will get into the reconstruction if these elements of that has been agreed basically in the ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel with a Qatari American pressure. These have to be placed on the table. We will see a proof of concept of this issue in the Palestinian camps. Will the Palestinian camps hand their weapons in a normalized manner or not? I think they will, but this is a long way. This is why I think the reconstruction is going to take time, and it will be linked politically, as we know, with certain milestones of basically the whole national defense dialogue. It's very important as well to understand that Lebanon, if we do not have a real defense strategy, we're going to go on a wall again, because this is exactly what happened in the 80s. The Southerners cannot be left so that Israel bombs every few weeks. There needs to be a serious intervention from a regional and international actors to stop Israel from breaching the ceasefire, which is regularly doing. So this is also a red line. If we do not do it, we will end up in more civil strife. Because even if Hezbollah ceases to exist, the basis of Hezbollah will continue operating because there's resistance. There's actually people living in the south. So this is a very important security issue that has to be dealt with diplomatically in a very, diplomatic manner. The second aspect would be fixing the basic services. I mean, we need to get back to basic electricity, like customs, getting the judiciary back. Ali was mentioning something about, the basic public good needs to be financed, and this requires more liquidity in the system to get the basics running. The third aspect I would say is we need a new social contract, which is, if Lebanon is an ATM machine, the ATM machine is bankrupt. If we are a base for missiles, the base of missiles is also bankrupt. So we're at a situation where we need a new social contract. And a new social contract means the social contract not based on rents of sects, but based on taxation. That's why a lot of reforms have to happen on the broadening the tax base, invoicing, digital VAT. We need to push Lebanon, basically transparency in the public budget, because this, I will tie it back to the idea of reconstruction. We can talk more, but the CDR, the Center for Development and Reconstruction, there's basically a complete lack of transparency in its operations. I can talk more later, I guess, on that, but this is a serious issue of the CDR, has to be dealt with if we're gonna have millions of dollars coming into reconstruction. 10 companies in the past 10 years, I think, got 60% of the budget of the CDR, which it does not report even to the public audit for audit approval. So there are serious corruption, mazarib, we call them in Lebanese. There's serious leaks in our administrative system we need to fix before we go into reconstruction. And finally, I would say that, again, without breaking the elite capture, which I mentioned, there's an impossibility in fixing the markets, because we need to open the market for competition, especially in reconstruction, where we're talking about billions of dollars. We don't want the same oligarchs that actually corrupted the system to come back from to basically rob what is left. I think I will stop here, and we can continue more when we look at it.
I definitely have another question coming to you about exactly this type of management of projects. So, but yeah, that's very important. 3 pillars that you outlined. The next question is for Lama. Alongside Lebanon's political and economic challenges, we also face a crisis of impunity, whether for the Beirut port explosion or the financial abuses committed within the context of the financial crisis. The Lebanese people have yet to see any genuine accountability and access to justice. Why is this the case, and what are the key accountability challenges the country has experienced?
Thank you, Nadine, and thank you for having me. So let me start by saying that the investigation into the Beirut blast has been resumed after 2 years of being on hold. So Judge Bitar is currently interrogating several suspects, and it is expected that he will issue his indictment decision by August 2025. Obviously, this is not guaranteed, but reports are indicating this. But to answer your question on the broader problem, the absence of accountability, whether in the cases of the Beirut blast investigation or in the financial crimes, isn't unusual. It's part of a pattern that has been going since the end of the civil war. Impunity has been embedded within Lebanon's political system, starting with the blanket amnesty law that was issued in 1991 and which absolved war criminals and militiamen of their crimes and allowed leaders to transition into politics and state institutions. So impunity is not, again, exceptional. It hasn't only been tolerated in Lebanon, it has been, in a sense, institutionalized as a core feature of the post-war power-sharing agreement. What we're seeing today, or in the last 5 to 6 years, the lack of accountability for financial crimes, the August 4 explosion, fits into this pattern. And even in the last 20 years, so we've witnessed a series of political assassinations that remained unresolved. So again, it's not exceptional. Maybe it's on a bigger scale. And impunity in Lebanon is not only for the macro political crimes. There's also impunity in everyday violations, starting with domestic violence, crimes against marginalized groups, even traffic violations. So it's a culture that runs through the entire justice system. And there are a few reasons for this. First, the political system itself fuels impunity. It starts with the clientelist regime that has been built on the idea of weakening state institutions and sidelining the state and pushing people to resolve their issues and to access their rights through informal channels. Our long-standing Speaker of the Parliament, Nabih Berri, once said that only the weak go to court. So I think this sums up the approach to the judiciary and to justice in Lebanon. Second, the legal system in Lebanon is heavily influenced by immunities, by a structure of immunities. And we've seen this with the investigation into the Beirut port blast. So when they were summoned in front of Judge Bitar, several ministers invoked ministerial immunities to avoid appearing in front of the judge. Others cited parliamentary immunities. Lawyers cited professional immunities. High-ranking security officers argued that they require prior clearance from their supervisors or from the Minister of Interior. So this excessive use of immunities and the politicized use of immunities has become one of the main tools to shield powerful entities or powerful individuals from judicial scrutiny and to stall justice. Thirdly, the justice sector itself lacks the necessary guarantees to conduct its work independently. And I'm not saying here that judges are corrupt. It's because they are bad, corrupt judges. Quite the contrary, actually, we do have excellent judges and we do have corrupt ones. But it's not a question of individuals who are corrupt. It's a question of a system that doesn't allow judges to conduct their work as they should. So judicial appointments in Lebanon continue to be controlled by the executive, so by the government, which means that in order to keep their job or in order to be appointed, judges have to rely on political support, which also means that it opens doors for further interventions within their work. And I think, as Nizar alluded, it's not only the powerful are not only politicians in Lebanon, it's also the bankers and the financial elite. So we've seen interventions from the financial elite in the judiciary, especially in the last 5 to 6 years. And as I said, judges lacked the necessary guarantees for their independence. And we can talk a bit more about judicial independence later on. And finally, resources. We have a serious crisis of resources in the judiciary. Even before the crisis, the judiciary was underfunded. The budget of the Ministry of Justice was not sufficient. Even when international donors wanted to help Lebanon, they mostly funded security forces, the army, the ISF, but there wasn't any support to the judiciary, and it was rather ignored. And with the crisis, the lack of resources became even more dangerous. Judges had their salaries slashed, even court personnel as well. We've seen a number of extremely qualified judges resign and join the private sector because their salaries were no longer sustainable. Courts lacked the basic infrastructure. I did my fieldwork in 2021 and courts in Lebanon, and in many cases the court session was postponed because there was either no electricity or because they couldn't bring prisoners from the central prison in Rumiyeh to Beirut because the ISF didn't have any fuel. So this is the level of lack of resources that we are talking about. So yeah, to put it, to sum it, or to put it simply, Lebanon's crisis of impunity is not accidental. It's the result of a political system that was deliberately designed to avoid accountability. And we can talk a bit more about the justice system and later on.
Thanks so much, Lama. That's really interesting. I mean, I guess for those stakeholders that are wondering where to support and invest in Lebanon, the Ministry of Justice seems like it's a place that needs a lot of support. So thanks for that. And I'll definitely turn to the question of judicial independence later on. Last question in this round is for Jasmine. Across all of these crises, marginalized groups, be they women, migrants, and refugees, have been bearing the brunt of these bad policies, deep-seated corruption, and abuses. How have these diverse yet all underrepresented groups experienced Lebanon's recent crisis, and what are examples of some of the key needs that they have at this moment?
Thank you so much, and thank you for the space, everyone. I mean, to build, of course, on what my fellow panelists have said, Lebanon's crises not only created a ripple effect of exclusion for already marginalized groups, particularly women, refugees, migrants, persons with disabilities, queer individuals as well, but it also exacerbated their already present plight. These populations are not just affected by the same crises that impact everyone, they are often uniquely, multiply, disproportionately impacted. For refugees and migrants, of course, Lebanon's economic collapse deepened long-standing exclusion from public services, protection, and accelerated a shift from neglect, in many cases, as we saw, to active scapegoating. For migrant domestic workers, primarily women under the kafala sponsorship system, they endured, of course, intensified labor exploitation, no recourse to legal remedies, social safety nets, and many of these women, of course, fired as a result, operating, living in the country without their quote-unquote documents in order as a result as well. For Syrian and Palestinian refugees already excluded, as I said, from formal employment, state assistance, they now face, of course, a double burden. The erosion of humanitarian aid and, of course, mounting political and popular pressure to return them, even when we make an argument that many regions are still unsafe and unlivable. We are hardly ever having a conversation as to whether or not Syria is safe at the moment for everyone. We're having a blanket conversation that needs to be much more unpacked and nuanced in that regard. These groups are not just structurally marginalized, but cyclically targeted through these selective crackdowns that intensify during moments of kind of national stress. Bringing us back to the scapegoating point that I was making earlier, from mass arrests of undocumented workers, curfews disproportionately applied to Syrian men, state enforcement often really serves more to display control than uphold rights when it comes to these groups. And refugees and migrants are routinely used as political cover for systemic failures. Women in Lebanon is a big category to unpack, but I'll answer your question maybe a little bit more intersectionally. Women, particularly those from displaced, refugee, low-income communities, face, of course, a sharp rise in gender-based violence, according to our findings and multiple studies coming out on this. This is compounded by reduced access to legal protection, safe shelter, and healthcare. And of course, on the healthcare point, very specifically, the collapse of Lebanon's healthcare infrastructure impacted access to sexual and reproductive health services disproportionately to other services, particularly, again, for refugee and migrant women. They're often excluded from subsidized care and face discrimination at points of service delivery anyway, so this was only exacerbated. And in moments of heightened social anxiety, from political upheaval to armed conflict, women in these communities are further marginalized. They're either targets of punitive morality campaigns or, casualties of a really shrinking public support system and a humanitarian space. We find explicitly in our work that when funding is cut, when there is any strain on any system, anything gender-focused or women-related or mental health-related for that matter, goes first. For queer individuals, of course, recent years have really set alarming waves of repression. This was marked by coordinated arrests, bans on pride events, police raids on queer spaces, and these crackdowns are not random. Amid everything we discussed and the situation of crisis that we discussed, we must emphasize that these are instrumentalized scapegoating mechanisms. They appear during periods of political vacuum, moral panic, when the state seeks to distract, from government failures. It's the refugees, it's the queer community, it's women, et cetera, et cetera. And while Lebanon is often framed as a relatively liberal space compared to its regional neighbors, which is true in many ways, but absolutely, nuanced and needs to be unpacked. It's not a blanket statement. Queer visibility is very selectively criminalized, right? Vaguely worded morality laws that permit for this arbitrary, of course, enforcement. If we look at marginalized groups and bringing it back to your question, there are intersections that happen there as well that not only compound these vulnerabilities, but create a hierarchy of vulnerabilities for certain individuals. So for queer refugees, the terrain is even more fraught. They are not only criminalized based on their sexual and gender identities, but also rendered kind of invisible within refugee protection mechanisms. They have limited access to resettlement pathways, legal representation, psychosocial support. In many cases, not because the services are not there, but because there is a lack of awareness within the community and a lack of emphasis on reaching these types of communities as well. And so when we discuss marginalized groups in Lebanon, we recognize that it's either that they are hyper visible when politically, expedient, and utterly erased when we talk about accountability or inclusion. Whenever that is demanded, the communities disappear and are diluted. I could go over briefly the second half of your question on what these groups needs, not to take up too much time, but we can definitely address that in the second round. At this stage, these communities need, first and foremost, legal recognition and protection. Reform really needs to shift. It needs to move in a direction where the Lebanese legal system recognizes and protects marginalized groups not as exceptions or temporary populations, but as part of the country's complex social fabric. This includes dismantling the kafala system, requires comprehensive reform on GBV violence to include everyone, to make it accessible to everyone. Legal and logical residency and documentation for refugees needs to be addressed, and legal invisibility needs to be addressed as an absolute problem. This is not a neutral condition. It is a tool of control that must be dismantled immediately. Building on that, inclusion in recovery and reform planning of these groups is very important. As you said, Lebanon is embarking on a new political chapter. Seemingly, our leadership is talking about reform and inclusion and coexistence, but for who? Who is left out of this conversation? Who is this conversation for? And what is this Lebanese population that we're always talking about and the coexistence that we're always preaching for? Who does this include? Recovery plans on that point, and I will end on this, they must be equity-based and not just efficiency-driven. prioritizing who's excluded from public systems, not just since the crisis began, but even before then. And as we look in the direction of reform, excluding groups that are simply inconvenient for the state at the moment, or that pose too much of a policy issue for them at the moment, needs to be something that we address. I think I'll leave it there, just not to go over time too much, but thank you so much for your question.
Thanks so much, Jasmine. I mean, you paint a very stark picture, and I think it's probably only going to be more sensitive now with the cuts to global aid funding and things like that. So definitely something to keep monitoring. All right, with that, I'll move into the second round of moderated questions. Turning back to Ali, you mentioned the importance of policies that ensure Lebanon's financial recovery and how that's related to the issue of reconstruction. What steps has the new government already begun to take towards economic reform, and how do these steps contribute to financial recovery? And as well, if you can, what steps has the government failed to take so far that they need to take on moving forward?
Okay, so at the level of the economic recovery plan, the government has already taken several important steps. The first was drafting a law to lift banking secrecy. This law was later passed by the parliament in a form that closely resembled the government's original proposal. So one of the most significant aspects is that it allows the Central Bank of Lebanon and the Banking Control Commission to access bank account information with retroactive effect going back 10 years. So this is crucial for conducting a fair restructuring of the banking sector by auditing the financial operations that took place in the years leading up to the collapse, and potentially reclaiming profits that were unjustly made. Additionally, the law grants auditing firms the authority to lift banking secrecy when commissioned by the central bank, and this enables broader and deeper investigations into the financial statements. The government also submitted a draft law to the parliament for banking sector reform. This law is key because it restructures the higher banking commission, the body responsible for making decisions about non-compliant or failing banks. It also clearly defines the powers of the Banking Control Commission, which will be responsible for auditing the bank's financial statements. And more broadly, the law is supposed to lay out the process for bank mergers and liquidations by clarifying the roles and responsibilities of decision-making and regulatory bodies within the central bank. And it also includes steps to prevent the conflict of interest. So, and it's worth noting that the current legal framework for this is fragmented, vague, and scattered across multiple laws. So the new legislation was very important. So when we talk about the other steps that need to be taken, the most important step is drafting the financial stability law. This law is expected to address how to manage the losses in the central bank's balance sheet and how to guarantee a minimum level of deposit protection. It will basically, this law will deal with the most sensitive issue because it touches directly the interests of powerful banking figures who play a major role in shaping Lebanon's political landscape. Already Nizar talked about this in his intervention. So together, these legal reforms are supposed to pave the way for the final agreement with the International Monetary Fund, which is an essential step toward meeting the economic conditions set by the donor countries. But beyond that, beyond the IMF conditions, the government must also push forward with reforms that are urgently needed by the Lebanese people, especially those aimed at restoring balance to the state's finances. And this would include improving the tax system, reducing tax evasion, while shifting to a more progressive taxing model. The increase in public revenues could then allow the state to increase its future spending on social programs, specifically supporting public education, governmental hospitals, and other protection tools. So I think this aspect, the government still needs to work on this aspect beyond the IMF conditions.
Thanks, Hadi. That's very clearly put. So the next question, back to Lama. As we discussed, Lebanon has long suffered from impunity, and you beautifully laid out the causes of that. But we now have a prime minister who served as a judge at the International Court of Justice and who ostensibly values rule of law. So what changes are you hoping to see from this government when it comes to judicial reform and the more institutional aspects of legal reform? Has any progress been made already by this government in that regard? And what do you think are the likelihood of success?
Thank you. So certainly having someone like Nawaf Salam at the helm of the government is a welcome departure from previous figures like Najib Miati, who has faced lawsuits related to illicit enrichment. But that said, I think the absence of the rule of law in Lebanon, as I think we can all agree, is not simply due to individuals who don't understand the law or don't respect the rule of law. It's rooted in the very nature of the political regime, as we said before. So I say this because time and again, I feel we place our hopes in new figures like Nawaf Salam, whether in the government or in the parliament, only to feel let down later, not because they lacked integrity or the intent, but because they were up against a system that resists real reform and substantial reform. Now, to answer your question, what we hope to see from this government is not just piecemeal reform, but a coherent and strategic vision for rebuilding the state. Legal reform is certainly important. We do need new laws. We do need to amend certain laws, but all these legal reforms must be embedded within a broader political project that is centered on state building and institutional recovery. Otherwise, scattered legal amendments risk becoming superficial and would only serve as ticking boxes for the IMF, the international community, without bringing any meaningful or substantial change within the regime. We've seen this happen when we were promised the CEDR, donor conference, and we've seen a series of laws that were enacted without bringing any substantial change. So there have been some promising developments on the legal front. The Judicial Independence Bill has been approved by the cabinet and forwarded to the parliament after a previous version had been stalling in the parliament since 2018. So this is an important achievement. The bill in its current version introduces very important standards to judicial independence, such as limiting the government's control over judicial appointments, strengthening the independence of the judicial inspection, guaranteeing judges' rights to freedom of expression and to assembly, affirming for the first time that the principle that judges cannot be removed from their position unless without their consent, unless in very specific circumstances. And it introduced important safeguards to prevent the abuse of disciplinary powers by judicial superiors, which is a problem that we've witnessed previously in the case of the Beirut blast, but also in other corruption cases. So the bill introduces very important standards. It adheres to many international standards on judicial independence. It does reflect certain compromises on sensitive issues related to internal dynamics within the judiciary or sectarian sensitivities. It's not an ideal law, but it is a good start for reforming the justice sector. As Ali just mentioned, also the banking secrecy law has been amended. Just to note, in addition to what Ali has mentioned, this law was the fastest law to be enacted in Lebanon since the independence, according to Wissam Laham from Legal Agenda. So it was passed within 1 day. Unfortunately, the speed appears to be driven by external pressure, notably from the US, and not driven by domestic political will, but still it's an important amendment. The government has taken also other steps that are in the right direction to state building, including recently the repeal of decrees that previously facilitated the privatization of public maritime property. This issue is extremely important, that has long symbolized corruption in Lebanon and the way public property has been commodified and used for private interests. So repealing these decrees was also an important step. These steps are, as my fellow panelists have mentioned, are just the beginning, and we hope to see moving forward more substantial reforms, including legal reforms that ensure the fair and transparent redistribution of losses, addressing Lebanon's growing inequalities, but also reforms that reflect the commitment to building a civil state, such as enacting a unified civil person status law, revitalizing public institutions, ensuring access to essential rights, healthcare, education, social security system. But most importantly, I think we need a renewed emphasis on implementation. Laws on paper are not enough. They might be enough for donors to give us money, but they need to also to be enforced and translated into real change. This requires not only legal and technocratic reforms, but also bold political and economic decisions that must be taken to restore public trust, but also to be able to fund these reforms. We need a comprehensive plan that addresses political and economic reform.
Thanks so much, Lama. That's a lot that's going on. But it's really nice to see some things moving in a positive direction. And just to pick up on these different reforms that Ali and Lama have laid out, Jasmine, to go back to the issue of the most vulnerable groups and what they're facing in Lebanon. Just briefly, I know you already mentioned legalization, but what reforms are most needed right now for these populations, and how can we make sure that these priorities and these needs are built into national processes like reconstruction and legal reforms?
I mean, thank you again so much. I mean, this is really the crux of the matter. How do we move from crisis response to inclusive rights-based reform? As I said, to meet the needs of marginalized communities, we need reforms on multiple levels, starting with legal reform. As I mentioned, repealing legal frameworks that fundamentally strip these people of their humanhood and fundamentally isolate them from broader conversations on rights. Repealing the kafala system, ensuring personal status and labor laws reflect international standards, especially in relation to gender equality, non-discrimination, and as I said earlier, taking into account that these are intersectional conversations for different groups of women and different groups of people with different legal statuses as well. Providing legal status pathways and basic rights protection for refugees, stateless persons is absolutely fundamental. No matter what type of conversation we're having on safety, no matter what type of conversation we're having on returning people in dignity, all of them valid and important conversations to have. But in the meantime, what are we doing for these people? As we typically are accustomed to in Lebanon, we expect a quick fix and a quick ad hoc reaction to absolutely every political instant that happens across our country and our region. And this simply leaves a lot of people through the cracks. Building on legal reform, as was hinted already, institutional reform, mainstreaming protection and inclusion into government programming, not just humanitarian interventions. We saw how weak humanitarian interventions are in the face of shrinking spaces, shrinking funding, a shift in donor priorities, donor fatigue, and that means that issues like refugee, including refugees in education and health system, really is at the mercy of these humanitarian actors that are often unstable in a lot of the locations that they operate, and also at the mercy of donors and shifting priorities to the conflict of the moment, right? So beyond this mainstreaming of protection and inclusion into government programs, definitely a conversation around strengthening accountability and oversight mechanisms for police officers, courts, detention centers, where many right violations also continue to occur. And I think maybe on a final note, something that we push for in our research very much and in our methodological approach is around participatory governance. A lot of these vulnerable groups that we insist are forever vulnerable, refugees, migrants, women, the LGBT community, they need to be treated as stakeholders, not as beneficiaries. Again, we don't get to selectively engage with components of our society and then call for nationwide reform. There has to be a meaningful engagement in national consultations, sector planning, reform committees that include everyone, or else we're going to be having this conversation forever, and this status of vulnerability becomes semi-permanent for certain groups as well. And one of the major challenges that Lebanon has whenever we do discuss participatory governance with stakeholders or we take our research to decision makers is that the data is missing. Lebanon does not have data, does not have numbers, does not have disaggregated data by gender, nationality, disability, legal status. How is policy work informed in the country? I think this is the next chapter in our conversation around reform as well. We cannot continue to reform blindly and selectively and isolate people from a reform conversation moving forward. And I think to conclude, there is a real risk that Reconstruction is framed in purely economic and technocratic terms as we discuss reform. And unless we discuss equity, access, participation, and we build this into this foundation, we will reproduce the same hierarchies that caused harm in the first place. And we will be in an endless cycle of discussing who is vulnerable and why, and who is indefinitely vulnerable as well. I think I'll stop there. I'm happy to answer more questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jasmine. That was really comprehensive, and it's a shame. I think we forget that we could become vulnerable at any moment. So maybe if the world could keep that in mind, we could stick to better policies all around. Last question for Nizar, as I promised, looking at the upcoming Reconstruction agenda, which is critically important for the country and often funded by stakeholders in Lebanon, there seems to be renewed interest in international investment. But what should we be monitoring around reconstruction initiatives and investment, and what do we need to look at to ensure we're not repeating the mistakes of the past?
Yeah, I mean, if we look at the past, you know, it's pretty. There's a consensus that the 1990 reconstruction done by Hariri favored the rich, because he used loans. He gave high interest rates for capital to of course lure them back to Lebanon after the civil war. But instead of moving then later into a much more tax system, we have regressive taxation. So the rich didn't pay anything, and we ended up with all our VAT paid by most of the Lebanese going to corrupt files. We can repeat that system. I mean, that system meant that we have Paris 1, Paris 2, Paris 3, I don't know, like the 4 international conferences that brought billions of dollars from Western capitals and the Gulf that were funneled into the central bank, into the Ponzi scheme that we call the bubble that burst in 2019. I think in Lebanon, there are people who are willing to repeat that model again. We need to break that model from Head Start. And we can break that model from the Head Start by ensuring that first, the central bank is independent. We need to definitely reform the central bank, plus all the banking reforms that Ali has mentioned. In addition to that, the CDR is, as I mentioned earlier, CDR, the Center for Development and Reconstruction, was built in the 70s as a humanitarian vehicle. And you can see other countries like Yemen, for example, Somalia have it. When, for example, the World Bank wants to send a lot of millions of dollars to a country, they don't trust that the government ministries could actually deal with that amount of money, for example, or for procurement reasons, maybe. So CDR is very sexy for international donors to give through. It's a vehicle that can implement in Lebanon. But the problem with it that it lacks transparency or oversight. Can you imagine, like the billions of dollars that were spent were not even going to the Court of Audit for approval in Lebanon for the past, since 1990. At the same time, the structure of the CDR is basically a couple of cartels. The blocs that rule the Lebanon have vested interests in how it's managed, and it doesn't report to the parliament. So it's practically an executive. It reports to the executive, and it's basically a kind of a black box. We need to break that. There needs, because there's no competitive procurement. There's a cartel structure. As I said, 10 companies got 60% of the funds for the past since from 2008 to 2018. And there's an oversized scope of the CDR. For example, CDR can implement agricultural projects like dams and agricultural roads, but it implements electricity and so it actually is the real. Sometimes in political economy we say it's the shadow government of Lebanon. It's the real government that is completely outside the spectacle that we call basically parliamentary democracy in Lebanon, which basically is sectarian infighting, and it's the real the deep state is the CDR. This requires, if not, I'm not sure if we have the balance of power to completely dismantle it, but we need to definitely reform it severely and bring back all the executive functions to the executive, to the ministries. The Minister of Housing, the Minister of Agriculture, that reports back to the parliament. That's a massive, big issue. Then there's the public procurement law. I think it was passed in 2021, but it's not implemented yet because, again, in Lebanon, there's, you can pass a law, but there's the implementation decrees. Then we definitely need the conflict of interest. Ministers in Lebanon in the past doubled as contractors. You had a prime minister that is running our, for example, Liban Post, the postal service. He owned a postal service. I mean, there's a complete conflict of interest. Nowhere in the world this would be allowed, that level of conflict of interest. So, and we need, mandatory asset disclosures by whoever holds a public office. I think that in a nutshell, what matters to me in political economy is that the new construction in the South or in the whole country, because the whole country needs reconstructing, doesn't end up having failed projects like the one we saw, for example, funded by the World Bank, billion-dollar dams that don't work. Qaraon Dam, for example, is completely polluted. They're now saying that they're going to get another loan from the World Bank to basically get polluted water to the south. It's serious issues related to international funding that have to be investigated. And we cannot replicate that on the idea that it's urgent. And I want to end with that for a long time, the cartels of Lebanon blackmailed the international donors by saying, if you don't fund us, Iran and Hezbollah are coming, the boogeyman, and they play that game, which are, for me, geopolitical pirates by all means. This cannot be continued. We're in a new phase, but for this phase to really be consolidated, we need to be, as Lama said, it's a realigning Lebanon legally, building it, going back to its tradition, basically, as a liberal democracy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nizar. That was very enlightening for sure. So now we're going to turn to the audience Q&A, and thanks so much to those who have already submitted questions. And a reminder that you can continue to submit questions via the Q&A function on Zoom. We already have quite some questions, so I'm going to start directing them. The first one I will direct to Ali. We have a question about, basically you mentioned the need for Lebanon's banking sector to recover in order to manage large funds coming in to help with the recovery. But the IMF said in March that reforms to the banking and transparency and compensating depositors are still not good enough. So what is the way forward, and can Lebanese banks manage these funds without 100% of the reforms the IMF is asking for? I guess Ali's internet went out for a second, so we'll go back to that question. Nizar, there is actually a few questions for you as well. I think I'm going to try to sort of merge them together. One of the questions is about basically, you spoke about the defense, National Defense Unit strategy, and how we need to find a way basically to stop Israel from attacking in order to move forward with this. And so I think the question is, first of all, how do you stop Israel's attacks? What's the method that you take there? How can we reconstruct in the south until these attacks are over? Is another question as well that I will attach onto that.
It's a very good question. I'll try to answer it. I might not have all the answers. I think the destruction, like the fall of the Syrian regime, as much as he was a dictatorship for sure, and I stood for long years against the regime. But now the destruction of Syria's assets, basically, because historically Syria in many ways protected Lebanon, not completely, but ensured some form of balance of power with Israel. Now there's no such thing. Now the only balance of power against Israel probably would be Turkey, maybe, but international guarantees. So we don't have, there is no military built up neither in Syria or Lebanon that is capable of doing this balance of power. So we definitely need a new security arrangement in the region that can stop Israel. I think there are positive signs coming. President Trump has been putting a lot of pressure against Israel recently for Gaza. Let's see if that, fruit is fruitful, because that would send definitely a message that this is possible, that America could be, also regulating and maintaining this balance of power. That would be definitely a definite, answer, I would say. But there's also a need for, it's linked for me to what's happening in Syria. If there's no stability in Syria, Hezbollah will not hand their weapons down, because they look at what happened to the Alawites in the in the north of Syria, the massacres, etc. The population, I'm speaking at a popular level, they will not give down their weapons, because they think that this is last time the Palestinian guerrillas in Lebanon handed down their weapons, there was Sabra and Shatila. Like the history of Israel's record is not really like. It's against handing down your weapons. If you're like, you wouldn't. I would say my theory, my opinion is that it will take some time. It's related to Syria, and then it's related to Iraq. If the new security architecture that is being placed in the region manages to bring the Arab Shia, meaning that there's an Iraqi Lebanese, there's a much more of a regional, broad diplomatic initiative that brings Iraq and the Shia Arab into the Arab fold, with a Gulf maybe diplomatic move that could stabilize. They can make an agreement, a broad agreement in the region that stabilizes the whole sectarian fight. We could speak about, a kind of a diplomatic breakthrough, at least for the Shia popular opinion in Lebanon, that has just lost all their, the South, and you're telling them, so we need more diplomacy on that issue, on that file, I would say.
Thanks so much, Nizar. Now I'll turn back to the previous question to Ali about IMF reforms. Apparently, they're still not pleased with the reforms that Lebanon has pushed through so far. So what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, it's not only about the IMF opinion. I think the reforms achieved so far are not enough, and they are not sufficient to achieve a full banking restructuring process. So the first law, the law which lifted bank secrecy, was important to disclose the information in front of the central bank and to allow for a fair banking restructuring. So this was important. The second law, the banking reform law, was important to clarify the roles and responsibilities for the decision-making and the regulatory bodies within the central bank. But these two laws are not enough at all. The most important law, the most important part of this process is the third law, which is the financial stability law. I already talked about it. It's currently the Ministry of Finance is drafting this law in coordination with the central bank, and this law will do the process that we call here the distribution of the losses. So it will specify how much losses will be, what will be the burden which will be held by the bank's shareholders, for example, and what kind of deposits will be guaranteed in the future period. So the first two laws will not achieve anything without the third law. So I agree. What the steps done so far are not enough to achieve or to make or to accomplish the banking restructuring process. We still need the financial stability law. Only when we have an agreement on this law, we can say that we have like a guaranteed process for a fair banking restructuring.
Thank you so much, Ali. Next, I think I will direct, well, actually, I'll see if Lama is interested in answering this question. If not, maybe we can open it to the panel. But we have elections coming up again in a year. And so the question is, how can we better prepare for these elections and ensure that, what needs to be done to build a stronger political alternative that makes people want to vote for these independent candidates in round 2?
Yeah. Okay, sure. I can answer, although I'm not a fan of change through elections. I don't think elections change too much, but I will answer this.
Well, that's a
I
great
think-
answer.
No, I mean, we have to learn from our previous mistakes, right? There is a need to develop a clear political project, and to convince people. Everyone is convinced that the current political class is bad and it needs replacement, and everyone keeps nagging. We don't need to convince people that the current situation is bad. I think we need to convince people how we can make it better. So what is the alternative political project? How are we going to ensure universal healthcare? How are we going to improve the public school system? How are we going to improve the social security system? Ali just mentioned only 20% of the Lebanese are covered by the social security system. How are we going to address the incredibly rising poverty rates? So I think it's going beyond these big titles. Definitely, I understand the Hezbollah problem is usually the center of attention in these political debates, and we do need to open this conversation, but we also need to open the conversation on other issues that are related to people's everyday lives. How are we going to improve everyday lives? And it's not only through these big titles of the NGOZ titles that people like, but more on what is the plan? How are we going to fund universal healthcare? Obviously, if we're going to fund a good public schooling system, it means we need more taxes. What is our plan for taxation? What is our plan for obtaining these resources? Who is going to pay the price? Obviously, in Lebanon, we don't have a problem of lack of resources. We have a problem of inequality of resources. So who is going to pay the price to ensure universal healthcare? What are the priorities? Do we want to strengthen public school systems, or do we want to keep the sectarian private schooling system? This is just a random example. So I think there needs to be political choices that are made and that are articulated clearly by alternative change parties, rather than adopting these very vague political projects.
Thank you so much, Lama. Is anyone interested in adding to that? Okay,
I could say
go ahead. Yeah.
the next election is going to be very dangerous for the change. That's my for the opposition, for the change opposition, for many reasons. Is that the Lebanese are in a different position now. They're afraid. They're looking around the whole region. It's instability breeds fear, and fear breeds identity politics, which fits with the more of the sectarian nature of the Lebanese system. So we have to be very careful of how we're going to manage the new elections. And then the last municipal elections is a case in point. It showed clearly that many of the Lebanese didn't even go to vote. So the question of the next elections is Achilles' heel for the opposition movement for many reasons, because we agree on most of the socioeconomic issues that we need to do in the country. The problem lies in the political aspect, like the role of Lebanon in the region, the nature of the Lebanese system. Because now you're remaking Lebanon again, as if you're in a post 1990. You're reforming Lebanon. What will be our position? People need to hear something about the future, not just about socioeconomic issues. And here, from my perspective, I believe in the Ta'if Accord, because I think this is like the some people speak about decentralization and we need to have, okay, but I don't think it will win. I think the Ta'if is still the common denominator that most of the Lebanese will agree on. Let's enforce it. But the change MPs, I'm not sure if they're in agreement with that, for example. So we have a big debate to be made about the new elections. I think the writing is on the wall.
Yes, I agree. Thanks so much, Nizad. Jasmine, I have sort of a mashup of questions for you. In part, we had a question about basically after conflict, countries can oscillate between sort of more liberalism and authoritarianism. And so this could actually lend itself to more scapegoating of refugees, queer communities, etc. And so, how do we counter that? How do we work on that and address it? And then also, alternatively, we've seen many Lebanese, especially Lebanese youth, emigrating due to the lack of opportunities here and instability. So what initiatives or policies could the government take up that would potentially help reverse this trend? And of course, others are welcome to provide input as well.
I think I'll answer the first question because the second question has been answered maybe across the last 10 decades at least, repeatedly. Happy to repeat, of course, with some additional nuance, but I think that is the million-dollar question, right? But also I think, no, let me start with the second, around this brain drain conversation that we're already having. How do you incentivize people to come back? Much of our research has centered around how the Lebanese model almost doesn't make sense, right? So for people leaving Lebanon and returning to Lebanon is a very emotive process. And in a lot of the qualitative work that we do, you will see that in instances where we have a perceived ceasefire, even though we all know that it's not, absolutely true or applied, that people frolic back, right? Or that people are cyclically leaving and coming back in instances where they perceive the country to be more stable. The Lebanese government has thrived on this. It's never felt the pressure to incentivize people to stay in that regard. Couple this, of course, with how much the Lebanese government benefits from remittances, benefits from the diaspora being the diaspora as well. Of course, the basic answers for this would be, job creation, a stable banking sector, a lot of educational opportunities also for different factions of people in different disciplines as well. But on a serious note, again, Lebanon disengages with the migration question entirely. It disengages with the displacement question, disengages with the diaspora question. So I think there needs to be a reshuffle and a reprioritization on that front. As we talk about elections and reform, and this of course ties into your first question, I hope we don't enter into a space of scapegoatism, right? Of the vulnerable groups that are here internally, but rather we, again, shape this new chapter of Lebanon in a sense that encourages people to come back a little bit more indefinitely, not for these sporadic moments where they come spend money here for the summer and then leave, right? So I think this question has been largely addressed, multiple times, but I think in light of the new political era that we're looking at, this definitely warrants a conversation. The problem with this conversation on crisis, the conversation that we've been having for the last hour, is that we unfortunately talk about prioritization across these different crises and not how to address them simultaneously and interconnectedly, right? So this conversation on brain drain the diaspora, how do we bring people home, does not even fall in the top 10 crises that the government prioritizes at the moment or that policy prioritizes at the moment as well. But I think maybe that's just my 2 cents on that. Your question actually ties a little bit into a question I saw even in the Q&A, which I hope you're comfortable with me answering, which is on kind of this post-war context, looking at South Lebanon and how, of course, this ties into scapegoatism and everything in between. It is absolutely fascinating how we still to this day in Lebanon deliberately turn vulnerable groups into sites of projection, right? So not only sites of projection, but also sites where we kind of use as scapegoats and use for all of the challenges and the inadequacies at the policy level. We filter these through individuals and we blame individuals for them and individual groups for them without structurally addressing, the inherent conditions that create this. At a moment of state disintegration, such as in South Lebanon, I see a few questions on South Lebanon in the Q&A. The vacuum of governance really creates a fertile ground for this moral policing. Moving back to the conversation on elections, even for independent groups that are talking about change and reform, we see that these vulnerable groups are isolated from their agendas, from their approaches. So it's not that we are looking at conventional political parties that are anti-refugee, anti-LGBT, say problematic things about women, say problematic things about society. We see this across the board, even in some of the most inclusive and advanced groups that are running for elections at the moment that are meant to counter this sectarian bias. It's either that these groups are still used as scapegoats or not referred to at all as part of this new chapter that we're looking at either. How do we counter this? I think a lot of the conversation around needs that we covered in the first two questions would be absolutely true. But I mean, the role of the media, I'm quite, surprised hasn't come up to this point because the public is largely shaped by this. We are at the mercy of the media, social media more specifically, in how different political actors capitalize on this to create environments where this is permissible. So when you hear someone running for elections that blames the economic crisis and go as far as blaming the Beirut port explosion on the existence of refugees and vulnerable groups, this is something that is normalized also as well. So I think the conversation needs to start there. But a pretty, I think, big question for the time that we have left. I hope I at least gave you some 2 cents on it. Thanks.
That was great, Jasmine. Thanks so much for volunteering to take a question that you felt comfortable with. Does anyone else want to add to that? Okay. Well, then another question that we had, actually, this one is directed to Lama. Given the deeply entrenched culture of impunity in Lebanon and considering the potential legal reforms, how can victims meaningfully engage in justice processes at the moment? How can their priorities on justice and accountability inform the reform process to ensure it's not approached as a mere box-checking exercise, but rather as a genuine effort to address structural injustice?
Yeah, thank you for the question. First, I think we're all victims, so I think we can talk about everyone. Okay, so I think the first thought that comes to my mind is that we should all be we should all be engaged in the process of legal reform. So historically in Lebanon and elsewhere, law has always been perceived as this very technical, difficult discipline that is hard to understand and that is often left to the experts and the technocrats. And I think this is very problematic. And we need to bring back law to mainstream law, basically, and to bring these connections. And this has actually been done during the uprising. So if you remember the days of the uprising, every corner in Beirut, you would see a panel on a certain law or a certain legal reform. And we've seen this increased interest in law and legal reform. We've seen protests stop or block the road to the parliament because they wanted to enact, if you remember, the amnesty law. So protesters took to the streets to block this law. So there was a popular interest in the law, and I think we lost this throughout the years because we've seen how law can also be manipulated and how law is malleable. So my first thought would be bring back the interest in law and in the legal reforms and vulgarize this legal knowledge. And I think there are many initiatives in Lebanon and there are many groups that have been involved in doing this. But also, I mean, one of the issues in Lebanon is that we don't have active unions and active syndicates. if you look at even the Beirut Bar Association or the Engineers Association, they haven't led the legal battles that we wanted them to lead. And this is also problematic because they are supposed to be leading these battles. And I think one issue that we should be working on is bringing back these coalitions or these lobby groups. It could be in different forms. There are many, for example, solidarity campaigns. I think Jasmine knows a lot about the solidarity campaigns with refugees, LGBT. So we need to bring back this collective effort in addressing the law. And we need to keep trying, basically. I mean, I can give a few examples from work with marginalized groups. When we thought it was impossible to challenge, for example, the criminalization of LGBT in Lebanon, we were able to succeed in doing this through courts. This is not to say that courts are leading the way to social change or to social reform, but to say that we can always keep trying and to use these spaces, to use legal spaces, courts, parliament, any legal space available to open these debates and to discuss these issues. I hope this answers the question.
That was great. Thank you so much. Well, a couple more questions, but this one I'll ask and see who's comfortable answering. What are the potential economic, social, and political pitfalls and risks to look out for in the reconstruction and recovery process? I think Nizar touched on them a bit, but if anyone has some quick thoughts of what the main issues are that we should be watching out for.
Can I answer this one? I worry a little bit about the political conditions that might be linked to the reconstruction process. I think delaying or obstructing the reconstruction process will not achieve the goal of reducing Hezbollah's influence or popularity, as some internal or external political sites might think. I think this move will be perceived or locally marketed as a financial and a humanitarian siege of Lebanon's Shia community. So I'm really worrying about this point. You know, that this process might be used to achieve some political goals or agendas, and I think this would backfire. I don't think it will reduce Hezbollah's popularity as some might think. I think on the contrary, it will be perceived as a siege for this community. And I think that completing the political change domestically in Lebanon cannot be achieved only through military or security arrangements, also as some external or internal groups might think. I think that developmental and economic paths must be also taken into account, and I'm afraid this is not given, the necessary consideration or attention by the international community or even by some political sides in Lebanon, who are only concentrating on the security arrangements and the question of the arms alone.
Thanks, Ali. Does anyone want to add to that?
Yes, I would like to add one thing. I mean, just to follow on what Ali was said, I totally agree. And I think that ideally, I mean, right now we're in a position where there's a regional agreement, regional détente, let's say. If we, this happened in the 60s with Shihab. If we manage to create, a kind of a group of reform-oriented MPs with a strong executive around the president, we could actually push for, for reforms in Lebanon. But that also requires a bit of, building the right coalitions in Lebanon for the reform. And this is why it ties back to the idea of Ta'if that I was saying, and there were comments about this in the chat about like, okay, aren't we gonna abolish sectarianism? I believe that we can abolish sectarianism in the lower house, in the parliament, but we need to instate a Senate, like the Ta'if says, because it will act like a constitutional court. It would relax the identitarian madness in Lebanon, saying, okay, this is the Senate, issues of war and peace, laws have to be, if Islamist, I don't know, party comes to power and abolishes alcohol, the Senate stops it. It acts like a constitutional court. that is good for Lebanon at the time being. We're not as much as I'm anti-sectarian, I'm with abolishing sectarianism completely. But then we need a very strong constitutional court, which doesn't exist. They destroyed it. So we need to be careful on what we dream and what is the reality, basically. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Okay, so last question for the whole group, if you can answer in about 30 seconds, mainly just your top line of what can the international community do for Lebanon that would be productive at this moment? What steps should they take and what should they avoid in order to not exacerbate this crisis? I guess we can start with, who would like to start? Ali?
Yes,
You
I
already
already
touched
mentioned one
on the
point.
international.
Yeah, yeah, I already mentioned my first concern. I think my main message, if I have a message for the international community, would be the international community must pressure Israel to complete withdrawal from the Lebanese territory in order to enable the reconstruction process in the southern border areas and prevent the continuation of the military tensions in the south in the future. Because without this withdrawal, the risk of the emergence of new conflict is there, and the legitimacy of the state institutions is put into question. And this is not helping at all. So I think they can play a big role in this regard. I already said this. I'm not against linking the reconstruction aid to the financial reform because this is for the interest of the Lebanese people and for the interest for the beneficiaries of the reconstruction path, because the reconstruction path cannot be achieved without an efficient and well-regulated public sector and financial system. So this is both a Lebanese and international interest. But as I mentioned before, I worry about linking it to political conditions such as Hezbollah's question or Hezbollah's arms, because this will take a long time to solve.
Thanks, Ali. Lama?
I mean, I don't have much to add beyond withdrawing, pressuring Israel to withdraw and ending the genocide, since we often forget that we live a few kilometers apart from a genocide, an ongoing genocide, and providing space for Lebanon and the Lebanese to resolve our internal issues without external pressure as well.
Thank you. Jasmine and then Nizar.
I mean, I completely agree with Ali and Lama. Absolutely. Not to end with a question on what the international community is at this point, right? As we question what this word means entirely. But I think there needs to be, yes, quite the reprioritization. The international community focuses on things like externalization deals at the moment instead of focusing on these humanitarian and legal concerns. So yeah, nothing to add, really. Thank you so much.
I mean, international aid conditional to financial reforms. That's one. The second thing is more trade agreements, so pushing Lebanon for a productive economy, not a service and banking sector. The third point is that the issue of Hezbollah is a sensitive issue. It's related to, it has to have a diplomatic track related to the region. So it's related to Syria, Iran, and it has a diplomatic track and to the internal dynamics in Lebanon. It has to be managed by a very competent diplomat, because at the end of the day, it's the Holy Lands, and nobody dies here. Everybody stays, for the next episode. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate all your interventions, and I'll turn it back to May now.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Lama, Jasmine, Ali, Nizar, for your incredible insights. This was a really rich conversation, and I think a really important discussion on political, economic dynamics, really underscoring that reconstruction is not a technical term, but rather the rebuilding of the state and the reimagining of the state. Thank you, Nadine, for your beautiful moderation. And of course, thank you to the Time Up team that organized this and made this work possible. Here at Time Up, we've been programming on Lebanon proudly since 2019, and Lebanon continues to be a priority country. We've been blessed to support incredible fellows in and from Lebanon to create a space for analysis on economic, legal, political issues, to convene Lebanese voices for solutions for the future, and to bring to places like Washington, D.C., Lebanese advocates where they need to be heard and need to be driving the conversation, including the voices of underrepresented groups. And so tune in. Please keep following our work at timeup.org and across our social media. And we'll see you at the next